Hi, it's Zeke again with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study of great chapters of the Bible. This time, we're going to study not an entire chapter, just the first 18 verses of John chapter 1. They are so unique to John's gospel. They are so power-packed and give us such insight into the theology and the character of Jesus that John wants us to see that it's well worth spending our time on just these 18 verses of John chapter 1. John's gospel is famous for a lot of reasons. There are several sevens that appear in the gospel of John. For instance, the 7 signs that Jesus performed that John carefully selected. Out of all the things that Jesus did, these are the 7 that John chose to talk about. Also, there are 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John, in which Jesus asserts his divinity. And all this coincides, or fulfills, maybe is a better word, John's purpose in why he so carefully selected these things. He says, "These have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." John 20, verse 31. And so, while some consider the first 18 verses of John chapter 1 to be a kind of a prologue or an introduction to his gospel, they are, but they're much more than that. They are John, inspired by the Holy Spirit, carefully chose to begin his gospel in this way. And his gospel is much more than simply a record of one man's life on earth. He wanted his readers to know just how special Jesus was, and he wanted them to know that right away. Jesus was so much more than a man, and John's gospel reveals his deity over and over and over again, and John wastes no time in asserting that deity in the first 18 verses of his gospel. He gives us, in verses 1 through 18, a brief overview of Jesus' identity, his nature, his character, his mission. It's a short retrospective on the sheer significance of Christ as he came to spend his time on earth. So let's begin in John chapter 1, in the first 5 verses, as John tells us something about who Jesus is. John 1, beginning in verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." The very first verse contains for us 3 basic affirmations of this one whom John refers to as the Word. He says that the Word was in the beginning. And these words are certainly meant to echo Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It identifies in John's gospel as the Word being present at the beginning, but more than simply referring to a particular moment of time, the creation, really the implication is that these words assume a timeless identity, a timeless eternity for the Word. Then he tells us that the Word was with God. And again, there's more to it than simply asserting that the Word was present with God. The phrase implies not only separateness, he was there, God was there, but also equality, that they were there together. It expresses relationship. In fact, some have suggested that maybe a better rendering would be the Word was face to face with God, because that also includes the idea of separateness, but also equality. And there are 2 important key ideas that are stated for us here in verse 1 that are brought together. They're repeated in verse 2 where he says he was in the beginning with God. It's that the Word was an intimate relation with God. And second, that this intimate relation was there from the beginning, or has always been there through eternity. In fact, John's gospel is going to focus on this relationship between Jesus and God. And their relationship depended not only on their separateness, but on their unity, on their equality together. Finally, John says in this verse that the Word was God. And again, John wastes no time in asserting the deity of Jesus. This final affirmation makes a bold claim and leaves absolutely no doubt about the divinity of the Word. While the Word is not the Father, the Word is truly as fully God as the Father is. This would be worth taking a minute to talk a little bit about this phrase, the Word. Here's a word on the Word. The word is from the Greek word logos, and it's got several meanings. Normally, it refers to the spoken word, with emphasis on the meaning that's conveyed, not just the sound. There's a meaning that's conveyed in the word. It's communication, and so the emphasis is on that expression of the word. And so logos, therefore, is an expression of power, of personality, of communication. Scripture tells us about the creativeness in the power of God's word. In Psalm 33 and verse 6, we read that by the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. Now to the Hebrew, or to the Israelite, the word of God was the self-assertion of God's power and personality. To the Greek, the phrase, the word, denoted the rational mind in their view that ruled and controlled the universe. John is asserting to us that the Word is that rational mind, but is not some disembodied, impersonal thing. In fact, he is a person, a personality, the source of all that is visible and precedes the material world. And he tells us that in the very next verse. He reminds us that Jesus, the Word, is the maker of all things. In verse 3, all things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. See, the Jews had Moses' testimony in Genesis 1 about the origin of the world. But they also needed to understand that the personage of the Word shared in that singular creative action. Jesus is this creator, and it's why Jesus could control nature, why we see so many of his miracles in the Gospels dealing with his absolute sovereignty over nature itself. And Paul expanded on this concept, and he wanted Gentiles, as he wrote to them in the book of Colossians, to grasp this about Jesus' supremacy. In Colossians 1 and in verse 16, Paul says, "For by him," by Jesus, "all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him." And he goes on to tell us that by him all things hold together. Jesus is the one who not only established the world, created the world, but also sustains the world through his power. The idea that the Word, Jesus, created everything, including all men, is perhaps the single best reason to believe that Jesus can save all men, because he created them. He knows exactly what they are, who they are, and what they need. In fact, John talks about that in John chapter 2 and in verse 25. We'll begin in verse 24. John says, Jesus on his part was not entrusting himself to them because he knew all men, and because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man, for he himself knew what was in man. Jesus didn't need anybody to tell him what man was all about. He was the creator of man, and so he knew better than even man himself not only what man was about, but especially his needs concerning salvation. Next, John goes on to tell us in John chapter 1 that this word is life and light. In verse 4 he says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. These two words, life and light, as you read through the Gospel of John, you'll see them again and again and again and again. They're repeated often. Oftentimes from the very lips of Jesus. Jesus used the words life and light a lot in John's Gospel. Now, life can refer to the principle of either physical or spiritual life. Either way, John tells us it resides in Jesus, as is his power or right or authority to give it, to take it, to do what he wills with it. In fact, remember John 14 verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. John explains this life in terms of light. Now, light has always been a hugely powerful symbol. And Jesus, of course, appropriates the best qualities of light to himself when he says in John 8 and verse 12, I am the light of the world, one of the famous I am sayings in John. Here in verse 9 of John chapter 1, John uses a different form of the same word that we identify with. In verse 9, he says, there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. And that's what light does, right? But the term enlighten doesn't merely mean to illuminate, to show something. It's got a much deeper, especially a much deeper theological meaning for John. Light has always been understood to physically expose, but also to spiritually illuminate, to make clear. And Jesus, coming as the ultimate illuminator, exposes sin, evil, ignorance. And he talks about that in John chapter 3. But more than that, he offers a clear way to overcome it. That's what verse 5 is all about. The light shines in the darkness, exposes all that darkness covers up, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Maybe a better way to express the final words in verse 5 is the darkness did not overcome it, or could not overcome it. Consider how that coincides with what Jesus said about how he came to enlighten us. In John chapter 8 and in verses 31 and 32, Jesus said, if you continue in my word, you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's another way of saying that the light shines in darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it. It's the truth that Jesus came to bring by his very life that is the light, the illuminator and the liberator of men. Back in John chapter 1, in verses 6 through 8, we find something out about the one who preceded Jesus, John the baptizer, and his witness or testimony of Jesus. Let's read it. John 1 and verse 6, there came a man sent from God, whose name was John. And he came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. Now we know about John the Baptizer's very special relationship to the light of life, to Jesus. They were in the flesh cousins, but they were more than that. John himself said that though he was not the Messiah when he was asked, he was the one who, as he quoted from the book of Isaiah, a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight the paths of the Lord, make ready the way of the Lord. He had come as what's called a forerunner to Jesus, to get people ready for him. In fact, that's what verse 8 tells us. He came to testify about the light. Why? So that in verse 7, that all might believe through him. First of all, we're immediately assured of John's divinely appointed mission. He was sent from God, but we're also told about his impactful work. Witness is another word. It's a distinct word that John uses several times in his gospel. John's gospel is itself a witness or a testimony to the claims of Jesus. Now, what does a witness do? Well, he provides testimony. He gives facts concerning a case so that people could not only ascertain the facts, but believe them and know the truth of what happened. And that's what John came to do. He was a witness sent to testify of the light. Again, so that all would come to believe in him. John's work was preparatory to the coming of Jesus. And in fact, Jesus in John chapter 5 points to the witness of John as evidential testimony to his own, to Jesus' authenticity. In John chapter 5, as he speaks to the Jews, he says, "You have sent to John, and he has testified to the truth. But the testimony which I receive is not from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was the lamp that was burning and was shining, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light." Now in John chapter 5, Jesus gives several testimonies as to the authenticity of the claims that he's making. And one of those evidences that he puts forth is the testimony of John. Because people believe John. And why not? Because John was speaking the truth. Back in the Gospel of John, John goes on to tell us about the way that Jesus was received when he came into the world. Let's read it. John 1, beginning in verse 10, says, "He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Remember when God created, Jesus created the world? When creation was completed, we read in a previous great chapter, Genesis chapter 1, that God saw all that he had done, and he saw that it was good. He saw that it was very good. But certainly by the time the Word, or Jesus, came in human form, there had been a very drastic change. Though the Word was the same, that's what Hebrews 13:8 tells us, Jesus is always the same, the world that he created was very different. John 1 verses 10 through 11 remind us of that. Though the world was made through him, the world did not know him. And though he came to his own, to those whom he created, maybe his own has something to do also with the nation of Israel, those who should have been ready to receive him. Those who were his own did not receive him, it tells us. Knowing and receiving for John are synonymous also with believing. And since his own did not believe in him, they did not receive him, and so they could not know him. And how ironic it is to us that the Jews, the very ones who should have been the most prepared to receive him, to know him, to believe in him, completely spurned the Messiah that they had waited so long for. In fact, John tells us several times of the fact that they did not know him, they did not receive him, and gives us several examples of the surprising unbelief of the Jews in his gospel. But the situation wasn't near as hopeless as we might think, because there were some who did receive him. John tells us in verses 12 and 13, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Jews were already, in a sense, children of God in that they were born into the nation of God's chosen people. But they weren't children of God in spirit. Their blood birth was insufficient, ineffective for them to receive the gift of salvation because they stood in unbelief. Remember, they didn't know him, they didn't receive him. Those things are synonymous with belief in John. Because they stood in unbelief, they failed to submit themselves to the will of God, which is the only thing that can accomplish this right to become the children of God. This word right that we're told about here in verse 12 is a word that's often translated as either power or authority. And so we're told here that it is those who submit to God who have the right, who have the power, who have the authority from God to become children of God. And we should know something very special here. Belief is the impetus that propels obedience. And we see that, we'll just look at one example. In the book of Acts chapter 8, Philip is speaking to an Ethiopian here, and he begins in the gospel, or he begins with the prophet Isaiah, and tells him about the suffering servant who was Jesus. And in Acts chapter 8, and in verse 36, it tells us that as they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, water! What prevents me from being baptized?" And Philip said, "If you believe with all your heart, you may." And the Ethiopian answered and said, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And he ordered the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water, Philip as well as the eunuch, and he baptized him. And then it tells us, in no uncertain terms, that the eunuch was saved. He received the gift of salvation. Why? Because he believed and he obeyed. Now, this isn't a treatise on baptism, but it does tell us how belief is so intricately entwined with the purpose of baptism that we shouldn't miss that. That goes hand in hand with what John is telling us here in John 1 and in verse 12. And although it's man who responds to his will, it is the work of God that is accomplishing this salvation. In Colossians chapter 2, let's turn there together. Colossians chapter 2. In Colossians chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, we read about those who have been buried with Christ, with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions. When did that occur? When did their forgiveness of all their transgressions occur? When did their being made alive again occur? Well, in verse 12, when they were buried with him through baptism. But what was going on there? Were they somehow earning their baptism through, or rather earning their salvation through the work of baptism? No, it tells us that God was the one who was working. Yes, they were obeying, they were giving of themselves in submission to God's will, but God was the one who was at work in providing for them and accomplishing for them the salvation that he promised. And this is exactly what John is talking about in John 1, verses 12 and 13. Back in John chapter 1, let's continue. And let's talk about how John says Jesus came. In verse 14 of John chapter 1, he goes on to say, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified about him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me and has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." Now there's a lot going on here. We're going to just focus in on a few very important things. First, let's just take a closer look at verse 14. He tells us in a very succinct yet almost incomprehensible thing to understand or to apprehend was that the Word became flesh. The eternal God became man. And not just any kind of a man. Mark's gospel depicts Jesus as a willing servant, always on the move, always reaching out to help other humans, other men, and certainly that's how Paul describes him. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 7, Paul said that although he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. And then it goes on to tell us that he became, as a man, obedient to God, even to death on a cross. Now, there is so much in this idea of the Word becoming flesh. Some have described it as the God of the stars became the God of the scars. For us, what must it have been like for Jesus, the limitless, eternal God, to envelop himself in the confines of human flesh, and to go through all that his creation goes through? What must it have been like to willingly forego the privileges, if you can call him that, of deity, so that he would take on life as a servant, a bondservant, a slave, as he's made in the likeness of men. John goes on to tell us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And this implies more than simply that Jesus adopted an experience of life alongside mortals. John portrays him as fully participating in all the experiences of his creation: hunger, thirst, weariness, frustration, sorrow, all that his creation went through, Jesus experienced. He dwelt among us. He experienced life as a man in the fullest sense, especially in the sense that men struggle with most. Hebrews 4 verse 15 says, "We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." Jesus experienced temptation. Jesus experienced testing. And he showed us by his experience that we can spurn temptation, that we can turn from the enticements of the devil. John goes on to tell us that as the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, we saw his glory. Glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, maybe in a way, Jesus, as Peter relates later on in one of his letters, they witnessed the glory of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew chapter 17. Remember that? But it's not only that Jesus showed himself at that one particular moment of time in his glory, and nor does his glory only lie in his deity, his power, and his wisdom, but in everything about him, in the life he lived, in the death he suffered, in the salvation he offers, in everything about him that makes him uniquely who he is. And that's what the only begotten from the Father is. People think, as the Jehovah's Witnesses do, that Jesus was some created being, and they point to this verse to tell us that that's what it means. But that's not what it means. The words only begotten speak more of Jesus' uniqueness, and maybe they would be better translated as one of a kind, because that's who Jesus was. He was one of a kind, the only unique Son of God, born of a virgin, born to do what you and I could not do. uniquely, fully God and fully man, uniquely qualified to represent us before God as he represented God to us. No one but Jesus could do that. And again, in John chapter 1 and verse 18, he uses that same phrase again, the only begotten God, to refer to Jesus. Again, just another example of how John repeatedly asserts the deity of Jesus. And by becoming flesh and dwelling among us, he allowed us to see God as never before. No one has seen God at any time. Verse 18 says, the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. Now, God is invisible because he's spirit. But Jesus, in his very self, in the words that he spoke, in the works that he did, shows us the very essence of God. In fact, in the words that he spoke, Jesus said he only spoke those things that the Father had given him to speak. In the deeds that he did, Jesus says, I only do those things that I've seen my Father do. In other words, the unity between the Father and the Son is interwoven so tightly that they can't be separated, although they are separate beings. And Jesus showed us God in a way that no other human being could, which is another affirmation of his uniqueness. John 14 verse 9, when Jesus was asked by Philip that he show his disciples the Father. Remember that? Show us the Father, Philip said, and it'll be enough for us. Jesus answered, have I been with you so long, and yet you've not come to know me, Philip? He said, he who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? By looking at Jesus, by observing not only the words that he said, the deeds that he did, but also by looking at the very character and nature of Jesus, we see deity. And that's what Hebrews 1 verse 3 tells us. Hebrews 1 and verse 3 says that he, Jesus, is the radiance of his, God's, glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. Jesus is the very essence of deity. It resides in him. And when we see him, we see deity. And so, in just 18 verses, John gives us this sublime glimpse into the nature, the mission, the character of Jesus as deity himself. And that's, when you think about it, the foundation of the Christian faith, that God revealed and explained himself to us in the person of Jesus. What a great start to a wonderful gospel. I hope that you've enjoyed this study. Hope that you'll join us again on another study of great chapters of the Bible. God bless you.